Hello, you're welcome to Across Cultures on Saskatoon Radio, CFCR 90.5 FM. I am Oyin Steve, your host. On Across Cultures, I have cultural conversations with guests from diverse cultural backgrounds to promote understanding and foster a sense of belonging as enlightened residents of a multicultural society. On today's episode, we'll be talking about the indigenous cultures, the history that has led to the current realities of the indigenous people, and the hope for the future as we embark on and individually contribute to the journey to reconciliation. This is especially important as we draw closer to Orange Shirts Day and the significance of September 30th for indigenous people. Joining me on the show today is Milton Tootoosis. Milton is a descendant of the Cree from the Battle River area near Battleford, Saskatchewan, who survived an attempted massacre by Canadian Armed Forces in 1885. His ancestors experienced immense discrimination, racism, and assimilation policy of the Canadian government for over 150 years. He is a survivor and now a thriver, taking that experience as a motivator to seek economic justice for his people by moving the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 92 forward. Tootoosis is the first ever appointed Chief Economic Reconciliation Officer for the Saskatoon Regional Economic Authority. Welcome to Across Culture, Miltons.
Well, tawau, and thank you, and thanks for having me.
Great. I'm so happy that you honored my invitation to join me on this show today. And like I said, it's especially significant because we're drawing closer to Orange Shirts Day. And I feel like not many people understand the reason behind and the significance of Orange Shirts Day and the history of indigenous people. And I want to go on this learning journey. And I know that a lot of my listeners as well would want to go on this journey. But as I was reading your bio, something stuck out to me that I'd like to start with. So you said that you are a survivor of an attempted massacre in 1885, which is over 100 years ago. I'm sitting across you now. You don't look like you're over 100 years old. So can you explain what you mean by you survived an attempted massacre by the Canadian Armed Forces in 1885?
Just to clarify, it is my people, my ancestors who survived that attack, and had the Canadian government succeeded in their strategic objective, and that was to massacre my ancestors on the morning of May 2nd, 1885. It's often referred to as the Northwest Rebellion in Canadian history books. We prefer to call it the resistance of 1885. The Canadian government had a plan to expropriate lands from my ancestors, our traditional territories, as many know or may not know, in the name of progress, and to complete the railroad from eastern central Canada to British Columbia. And during that time, they basically starved out my ancestors. They wiped out the bison or buffalo, prairie buffalo, bison, I prefer to call it the bison, and starved our people and coerced them to enter into Treaty Number 6 in 1876. 9 years later, many of those treaty promises that were made in exchange for sharing 120,000 square miles of land in that Treaty 6 territory alone, the Canadian government failed to deliver on the goodies and the treaty promises, the rations that they had promised, the medicine, agricultural implements, the schoolhouse that they had promised in order to educate our people. Many promises were broken, and so the warriors and the chiefs of my people, my great ancestors, got a little unsettled, and they wanted to remind the government, the crown, that there was a treaty, and they had promised to never take up arms against the Queen in the treaty, and the chiefs stopped the warriors from attacking settlers in the north Battleford area, the Battlefords as we call it, and then even in this area, just north of Saskatoon, there's incidents that took place throughout 1885. So there's a lot of unrest, civil unrest, and my chief, my great grandfather, going back 5 generations, was a guy named Chief Poundmaker, Bitakwahana Piwen. He was labeled and targeted by the Canadian government as a troublemaker, along with others, but I'll keep it short. And so the Colonel Otter decided to take action and to punish Chief Poundmaker for being a rebel, I guess, and disobedient to the Crown's officials in this territory. Decided to attack a camp of women, children, elders, but the warriors decided to respond, and they outmaneuvered Colonel Otter and his men. There's a couple hundred of them, and because they knew the land, the terrain of the valley they were fighting in, or the hill, I should say, and then the ravine around it, they outmaneuvered Colonel Otter, and who had advanced technology at that time. He had a Gatling gun and modern weaponry, and our ancestors had inferior weapons, but they figured out how to outmaneuver using, I guess, what we call guerrilla warfare tactics, and they forced Colonel Otter to retreat. He ended up retreating back to Fort Battleford. There's a few casualties, and as a result, our people won that battle. And unfortunately, Poundmaker and his warriors and many of the allies, First Nations allies, we have to be clear, there is a difference between First Nations and Métis. The Métis had their own challenges with the Canadian government just north of Saskatoon at a place called Batoche. It's a national park today. But they had their own battle. The First Nations in the Battlefords, my people, had a very unique and separate battle, and the issues that they were confronting the Canadian government with, and that is the failure to implement the treaty promises. So again, it's a great story, and had the warriors not outmaneuvered Colonel Otter, they would have been massacred. They would have been all killed. And thank goodness the warriors were smart, outmaneuvered, and we're here today.
Yeah, I think it's so profound the way you talked about it, and talking about just looking at it in hindsight, that if that massacre had been successful, you wouldn't have been here today, and many other Indigenous people also wouldn't have been here today. And one of the things that also stood out to me when you were talking about that history is that the Indigenous people had a treaty with the Canadian government, and even though the Queen did not honor that treaty initially, the Indigenous people honored theirs. Because, like you said, one of the treaty was you won't carry out arms against the Queen.
Correct.
And you stood on that, even though the Queen wasn't doing their own part, fulfilling their own part of the treaty. And that also brings me to the Truth and Reconciliation call to actions today. Even though the Commission had brought that out and the government has committed to fulfilling this call to actions, it doesn't appear as if they're doing as much as they should be doing. Yet, the Indigenous people are still forced to hold their end of the agreement of the Commission. But before we talk about that, I want to take you back history lane a little. Looking at the Indigenous people today, we have all heard about the residential school system and all of it. And recently I was taking a course, I think it's called the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course with the First Nations University. First Nations University. And they refer to what happened with the residential school system as cultural genocide. When you hear that word, cultural genocide, and looking at your people today and the history of your people, because I see you as a custodian of the history of your people, how would you describe that cultural genocide, and what are some of the effects you see today as a result of?
Well, first and foremost, it's well known now and documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their research that numerous, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of indigenous children perished in those institutions, in the what we call, I don't even call them, I want to call them schools, because they were more like institutions. And so we know there's a lot of atrocities, murders. We know about the rape that went on, the child abuse, sexual abuse that went on. Now it's all coming out. It's very tragic. And some of the ramifications from all that abuse, be it mental, physical, spiritual, is there's been a lot of dysfunction in our families. I am a survivor of that process. There's been a loss of language, loss of identity, proud cultural identity. I drove by Oskayak High School this morning after my coffee meeting on Broadway. I saw that there's a teepee set up right in front, on the front lawn of Oskayak High School. Very visible to anybody driving down Broadway. And I thought, oh man, is that ever? That
The
just
pride,
so
right?
proud.
Yeah.
It made me smile inside, and I had to stop, take a picture, and say, oh man, it's about time. Because when you see the iconic teepee, that mobile dwelling that my ancestors, the Plains Indians, if we can call them that, invented, and when those teepees were taken down by way of killing the spirit, killing the child, killing the spirit of that Indian child, as they say, kill the spirit in that young individual. It took away a lot of the cultural imagery that we are aware of, and really demeaned us. It really put a negative image in our minds to make us think that our culture was inferior and not worthy. Growing up in northwest part of Saskatchewan in the 60s and 70s, I grew up on an Indian reserve, on the Poundmaker Indian Reserve. We grew up with language. We had family. We had plenty of food, because my ancestors, my immediate grandfather and grandfathers were very successful farmers. They had transitioned from hunters and gatherers to farmers, and did really well at that. So I grew up as a kid, I think, in a very positive environment. But as soon as I left the reserved community and entered public schools and into the cities, like say North Battleford, even this town, Saskatoon, Lloydminster, when I was a kid, I thought they were big cities. We knew there was a difference. We could sense as children there's a big cultural difference, and then an economic difference. On the reserve, we didn't know we were poor, because nobody considered us poor. But as soon as you stepped into the towns, white towns and cities, we were poor. Right?
Yeah,
Poorer
'cause
than
then you
everybody
have-
else.
yes.
We didn't have the stuff that everybody had. And so it made us feel really, really inferior again as kids. So I think it had the impacts it had was psychological, if anything. Yes, we were poor when we were off reserve, but on reserve, I think I like to say we were rich in different ways, because we had family, we had language, we had ceremony, we had culture there. And it felt so good, right? Growing up, I was speaking my language fully, and I still fluent today as a result.
That's great.
And I thought everybody spoke Cree, right? It wasn't until we went to school that all of a sudden we had to try and learn the dominant language, which was English. And we struggled initially, but then we caught on. But again, I think some of the biggest damages done, as you mentioned, as you asked me earlier, was the loss of language. A lot of my peers, I am 61 years old, many of my peers cannot speak our language. Some may understand it, but many have lost the language. So again, that's I think studies have shown, and I took psychology in university many years ago, that language is core to any culture. Once you lose your language, you've lost a good
chunk of your
good
culture.
chunk of your culture.
Yes, yes. So you talk about language, you talk about identity, but one thing you also mentioned that struck me was cultural imagery. And you mentioned TP. I don't know what that is, and I should probably learn more about that after. I will definitely learn more about that after this recording. But what was the significance of that? Because you talked about how the Canadian government took all that down and how that affected your psyche, even as children, and affected how you viewed your culture. So, what was the significance of that cultural imagery,
Yeah.
and why was it so important for your culture?
Yeah. The Plains teepee of my ancestors was invented, who knows, centuries ago. It is a mobile dwelling. It's shaped like a triangle, like so, right? And it is an incredible engineering innovation because they could.
Oh, I think I remember. I must have seen it somewhere. Yes, yes. Now
Yeah.
that you described
So
it,
they
I'm sure
could.
I've seen it.
Yeah, the ancient Plains Indians, my ancestors, could construct and set up these mobile dwellings and take them down very quickly and move their campsites very, very quickly. They were lightweight, and because of the engineering design, it being a triangle, and the way they were structured, could withstand strong winds on the prairies. And they could withstand they say potentially tornadoes from a distance, of course, not in the middle of a tornado, but again, it's just amazing feat of design and engineering. And again, it's an image that I've seen growing up, but also influenced by the Hollywood film. The Western film about the wild, wild West and the cowboys and Indians. They always had teepees in the films, right? Designed and of course by Hollywood producers in Los Angeles and so on. So I always thought, wow, that's a cool image. So I always connected my people, my culture to the teepee, right? And I didn't realize till many years later that not all Indigenous peoples lived in teepees. There were longhouses in other cultures. There was actually permanent structures in other cultures. Indigenous peoples in the Southwest, for example, in Arizona, New Mexico, and that area, were the first to make apartment dwellings, for example, permanent structures in the mountains, in the rock, right? And so the indigenous peoples on the West Coast built log homes, lodges that were called longhouses. Same with the indigenous peoples on the Great Lakes region. So again, very, very diverse. Further north, the Inuit people made ice houses, ice homes out of snow and ice called igloos, right? Very, very, very thick, insulated, well insulated. It's amazing that they could survive in extreme cold weather. So, growing up, many of us had long hair. We saw our ancestors, grandparents with nice long hair in braids. Usually the men had braids. I had long hair. Never had long hair long enough to have braids. But again, that is a symbol of our connection in our spirituality. The braid would symbolize, for example, sweetgrass. It's a medicine that we have today. And I'll show you someday, and you'll understand better. But again, these are symbols we saw growing up as kids. Even the foods, the type of foods we ate, natural, indigenous foods, wild meats, fish. We had berries, Saskatoons, choke cherries, which are very common in and around Saskatoon as well. And so again, all of that was taken away. We were told basically that is not good, that does not fit into this dominant culture. Put it aside. In fact, we're going to force you to walk away from it all and adopt the dominant cultural ways. And I think it was so harmful. When I think back now, I did not realize I was a product of this assimilation machine that the government of Canada enforced upon my people.
Yeah. And as you talked about it, I don't fully understand the significance of these things, but I tried to put my own experience as an immigrant in Canada into your experience. And I just imagine now, I am originally from Nigeria, and I have my language, I have my food, I have my accent, I have these things. And I just keep wondering, I came to Canada by choice. I chose to leave Nigeria to come to Canada. Yes, the dominant language in Nigeria is English, but I have my local language as well that I speak. And I just wonder, what if I was forced to stop speaking my language? But just sitting here and trying to put myself in that shoe, that's not something you get over so easily, especially since it's something that went on for such a long time. But as we try to take a step forward and looking at the history, the impact of the history, are there specific things that you think could be done, or that you think could be done to help them move from being survivors to being thrivers?
That's a deep question. I consider myself very fortunate to come from a family of my father and mother had 7 children. I'm the middle child. My mother had 2 children before she met my father. So I have 8 other siblings. And I would say most of us did okay, despite the lack of real affection that our parents showed us as children because of what they experienced at residential school. So they're very cool. I never heard my late father say "Kisagitan" in Cree. That's "I love you." My mother, I've never heard her say "I love you, son." And now I know why. Right, so I've forgiven them now that they're gone now. But now that I understand what they went through, all the traumas they went through, now I understand. I get it. So as a kid, I instinctively saw the alcohol abuse, the physical abuse, the anger that my late father would show when he had one alcohol beverage too many, and it wasn't a good mix. But I also saw the good side of them. They were leaders in the community. I learned that my grandfather was a very successful farmer. He was a headman. I learned my great-grandfather was a chief for many years, and so on. So I saw leadership, I guess, now that I learned about leadership many years later, and I thought, okay, they were leaders.
You didn't have a word for it, but you knew what you saw.
I was exposed to it, and I was exposed to community leadership, community developers. They went through a lot of trauma, but they also made a decision to say, okay, I'm going to improve my economic future by getting an education, maybe some training, and get into the labor force. So I guess as a young individual, I saw that. And yes, there's a lot of negative and trauma, but I also decided at a very young age to stay in school. Although I dropped out of high school, smoked too much weed in my day, and I wasn't a good student in high school. But when I got to the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College in Regina, which is now the First Nations University of Canada, it was just a little tiny college, maybe a couple hundred Indigenous students there. I found my home. I found a home, and finally, it was just an amazing experience. I got excited about learning. I never did homework in high school. I just barely got through high school. Dropped out for a while, came back. But it wasn't until I took my first Indigenous Studies 101 course at university where I decided, aha, that explains what happened to my people, my ancestors. It explains why I'm who I am, why I am the way I am, I should say. And then I understood the impacts of 1885 and the Northwest Resistance, and why Chief Poundmaker got incarcerated and sentenced to prison, why there's so much unemployment, high alcohol abuse and addictions and poverty. It all made sense. And then I wanted to learn more. So I ended up minoring or majoring in Native Studies. They call it Indigenous Studies. As a minor in sociology, and then some public administration as well. So because I knew that
Great.
we had to, in order to improve the economic future, we had to get a better handle on our governance, our politics, and start building an economy. So.
Okay. So we will go on a short break now. I want you to hold that thought because I want us to continue that conversation.
Yeah.
But we'll go on a short break now, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation on Indigenous culture with Milton. Are you a newcomer to Canada for less than 1 year? Immigrant Muse, in partnership with TELUS, offers newcomers a special phone rate starting at $34 per month with 50 gigabytes of data and 1,000 minutes for international calls. For starters, you can get a free no-obligation preloaded SIM card to help you hit the ground running for the first month when you land Canada. After that, you can retain the same number with TELUS preferred rates for newcomers using our code DCC7691. You don't need a credit card or credit history to access this offer, but you can use this to build your credit history in Canada. So what are you waiting for? Visit immigrantmusemagazine.ca to access our exclusive newcomer offers. Welcome back to Across Cultures, and if you are just joining us, I am joined today by Milton Tootoosis, who is taking us through the history of the Indigenous people and also trying to lead the way forward as we go on a journey to reconciliation. And this is especially important as we go towards the Orange Shirt Day in order for us to learn and try to have better understanding of the indigenous cultures in order to also respect the indigenous people and fully understand their history, their current realities, and the way forward for the future. So again, Milton, as you were talking about just before we went on the break, you were talking about your personal experience with your background, your history, and how that impacted you through high school. You were not serious in high school, but then you got into the university, learned about your history, your culture, and something clicked for you. And from then on, there was a change. So looking back at your own experience and looking at the indigenous people, many indigenous people out there today, what are some things you think that maybe it is everybody individually within their own sphere of influence can do in order to help indigenous people move from being survivors to thrive?
Well, first and foremost, when I went to the Indian College at the University of Regina in 1980-81, I think it was, long time ago. But that was the first time, Oyen, that I had indigenous instructors or teachers, in this case professors, in front of me. And every single one of them, as I got to know them, had a similar story about overcoming trauma and then being successful academically, despite all the hurdles. Everybody has challenges. University is never easy for anybody, but they had more issues than the average student. But they did it. It made me realize and believe then, within that first semester, after meeting my professors who had journeyed to, say, Harvard University or went to McGill University and other prestigious schools and some not so Ivy League schools, but they did it. And it's the first time I realized that if they can do it, just maybe I can do it. I also started hanging around more studious students, indigenous students from across the country. There's a couple hundred of us on campus, and I realized after my first year, many of my buddies, the so-called buddies I had made in the first year, didn't return. I didn't realize they had gotten required to discontinue RTD because they weren't doing homework. They weren't doing their homework as they should have been. So I decided to disassociate with them and forget about them and move on and start hanging around the library more instead of the pub. Simple strategy. I also learned to get a tutor when I struggled in certain classes. So I was instructed to find a tutor. So I swallowed my ego and found a tutor, and I got through. I improved my writing, and because I was a poor writer, but I managed. And worked my butt off. Put in the hours. Worked part time while I was in college, and by the time I got to year 3, I realized I'm almost there. I'm halfway. I'd better finish, and I don't want to be a dropout statistic. Because back then, the dropout rate of Indigenous students from high schools, especially colleges, was very high. And so, yeah, I just got excited and realized, oh my God, I want to make my mom proud. I want to make my daddy proud. And I want to be the first in my family to have a college education. So many little moments like that, as lonely as it was sometimes, as difficult as it was, I knew the option was not a good option. Dropping out, leaving, going back to the reserve where there's no jobs at the time was not a good option.
Good option. It's really amazing to hear you talk about how learning about your history, seeing people who have similar history as you succeeding, being your professors and your lecturers and all, and also hanging out with the right crowd. Really helped you.
So
And
important.
let me go back to the part about learning about your history. Looking at our education system today in Canada, in Saskatchewan, do you think that the Indigenous history is taught well enough in schools?
I know there's treaties in the classroom curriculum now, because I used to work for the Office of the Treaty Commission for 10 years, so I know there's a policy there, but it's not mandatory. Even in university, I think in some colleges it is mandatory, but for the vast majority of colleges, it's not mandatory. So I would say not. There's not enough. It's there. It's better than it used to be, better than during my time in high school in the 70s. But today, yeah, the curriculum is there, but I don't think, from what I'm hearing from my friends in the education sector, it's not enough. I think, personally, if all students are planning to stay and live and work in Saskatchewan after their university education, they should at least take one course, at least take the 101 course.
Yeah, and I think it's also very important, because I remembered when I first came to Canada, for the longest time, I found it difficult to get a job because maybe because I work in communications and marketing as well, many of the jobs that I was being interviewed for required knowledge of Indigenous people.
Okay.
So, and that was when I started trying to learn more. What is it about Indigenous people? Why are they so relevant to the history of Canada? Why are they so relevant to my job, that I need to learn about them? And I started learning and taking in more knowledge and reading books, watching YouTube videos and all of it. But for me, that was a personal journey that thankfully I started because it was required for my job, and then eventually just enjoyed learning more about this and acquiring the knowledge and all. But not every occupation required that, right? So, and I think I hear a lot of immigrants talk about Indigenous people, and they say certain things because of their lack of knowledge. And I also wonder as well, just like you think your opinion is that Indigenous education should be mandated to a certain level in colleges, I also think that maybe mandated might not be the right word, but at least newcomers should be encouraged to learn about Indigenous cultures. And also backtracking a little bit, when you talked about the importance of cultural imagery. I remembered recently I was wondering, have I ever really seen a profound Indigenous imagery that had me stop and question, what is that about? I've been in Canada now, Saskatchewan now, for close to 8 years. And I wondered if, when I came through the Saskatoon airport, I wish there was a really captivating artwork, maybe mural, something that would draw me close and make me want to learn. Who are these people? What is this drawing about? What is, because that is how, through cultural imagery, we gain curiosity about other cultures, and then we learn. I feel like many of the things we know, or many of the things that I've heard immigrants say about Indigenous people, start out from stereotypes.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, don't live on the west side, or don't look for a house on the west side because of, don't put your schools in a particular school because of. So people start to hear about that, and then there isn't so much interest in even learning about the history, the rich cultural heritage of the Indigenous people. So I think when I sit down to reflect about some of the things that even the government can do, or even private organizations can do, individuals can do, I think these are some of the little things that we can come together to do as well. Let's put something really positive about Indigenous people. I want to learn about, yes, we see all the stereotypes, we understand why that happened, but tell me about the interesting, the most intriguing part of your culture as an Indigenous person.
Besides the song and dance, there's our traditional song
colorful.
and dance is so colorful. It's beautiful. It's all connected to creation and God's creation. Very unique. Every powwow regalia, we don't call them costumes. Regalia is unique to the individual, so that you will never see two regalias that are exactly the same, and none of it is made in China. It's all handmade, still handcrafted, so that's unique. The songs are unique. They're spiritual songs. There's ceremony in the songs, in the dance, song and dance, called a powwow. We call it now a powwow. And there's a unique story how that originated. But at the end of the day, what I've learned, I used to dance powwow when I was very young. I've got pictures of that.
That's such an energetic dance,
and we just thought that everybody did this. Again, it's part of who we are as human beings, as the Iniwak in my language is like human beings of the area. And we just assumed, well, everybody must know how to must have their own dances, their own songs. So little did I know that that's not the way. A lot of times, other than what's that annual cultural event in town where you go and eat different foods, and it's just for one day. Folk Fest, yeah, it's a one day, once a year. Maybe somebody will take pride in their Irish ancestry, for example, and then forget about it. But we do it all summer, all year now. We have ceremonies. As a kid, I was taken to traditional feasts. I was taken to Bagwe Simun in our Cree language is the rain dance. It's sometimes called the sun dance ceremony. Very sacred, one of the oldest ceremonies we have in our culture. And later on in my adult life, I was introduced into the sweat lodge ceremony as an example, like purification ceremonies and meditation ceremonies. Again, all of this is being revived and rejuvenated, and thanks to knowledge keepers who've many of them are residential school survivors, have hung on to those ceremonies and are now sharing them with us. So again, there's a lot of cultural pride. I think there is a silent renaissance happening. Indian horse relays is another very popular extreme sport event that's highly profiled at the Calgary Stampede in Calgary in midsummer. There's many Indigenous horsemen and women are involved in chuck wagon racing, for example. It's very, very dominant in that sport as well. We're getting dominance and presence in ice hockey. As you're probably aware, in Canada, that is our winter sport next to curling. But again, lacrosse is an Indigenous game, an invention by Indigenous peoples.
I watched a movie about that, and I was so impressed when I watched that.
So sport, song, dance, our foods are making a resurgence, native foods. indigenous to the land, etc. So it's an exciting time to be indigenous. I can guarantee you that.
So, if you're just tuning in, this is Across Cultures on CFCR 90.5 FM, and I have Milton Tootoosis with me talking about indigenous cultures, the past, the present, and the hope for the future. So, taking you back to cultural pride, you just said that this is such an amazing time to be an indigenous person. And I remembered, I think when we had coffee, you talked about your grandson keeping a long hair and how people would mistake him for a girl. And I remember you showed me the picture and I'm like, oh, such a cute girl. And you said, no, it's a boy.
Yeah.
So you just said also that there's so many things that are being reawakened now to also reawaken your culture and cultural heritage. How important are these things to healing the trauma and going from just being survivors to thriving?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, we all know we're not English, we're not French, we're not German, Polish, Ukrainian. That we're indigenous. We are Nehiawak. In our language, we have our own word. We're often referred to as Aboriginal people, indigenous peoples, but we have our own terminology for who we are. We know who we are, as many new immigrants would have, or new arrivals from their own countries. They know we're labeled. We're always labeled.
Yes.
We're the most labeled people in Canada. I could go on and on with that, but we are the Inuit, and we have to reaffirm with each other, with ourselves, with our children, our grandchildren, that we are the Inuit, we are the Nehiawak, we are the Cree, we are indigenous, and to be proud of that, because we'll never be anything else. I think we have to reaffirm with our community that the Creator, God, all made us unique and different. And I often think if He made us all the same, wouldn't it be kind of boring? Right?
Very boring.
It'd be boring. If we all spoke and had the same skin
Language.
color and texture, same language. It's just not the way the God, our Creator, designed the universe, this world. He instinctively made every blade of grass unique and different. He made everything, every leaf on a tree different. No two snowflakes are ever the same. Isn't that amazing?
It is.
God is amazing, and He did that to us, for us to enjoy the diversity. And
So
indigenous.
why would we even want to be the same in the first place?
Exactly. So somebody came along, imperialists, the colonizers, and said, those people are inferior. They're not quite human. They don't have a culture worth keeping, so we're going to indoctrinate them. We're going to change their way of belief, take away their spirituality, and make them all little farmers. And that's what they did with these residential schools. Those kids were basically slave labor, child labor, slave labor. They were. It was just so cruel what they did to those kids. My own parents went to their grave, didn't have an opportunity to share with us what they really went through. They wouldn't talk about it. And so they passed away before the apology by our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, at that time. So they never got any compensation. So again, I just think I want to reaffirm that it's cool to be Native, it's cool to be Indigenous, and we have to be proud, just like many other cultures around the world.
Yeah.
Not every culture around the world has succumbed to colonization. In fact, I think it's the reverse. It got stronger, and that's what I envy and really cherish when I see new arrivals, new immigrants coming to this country, coming to Saskatoon, and say, because I often hear when I go to a Sobeys grocery store or the Walmart, and I will hear little kids talking their own native language. And it's just so cool. I thought we have to do that. I understand there's cultural groups in the city where they'll go to a white school, a common public school, Monday to Friday, but they'll have their own language courses and cultural programs on weekends, right? So again, that's things we need to do in the Indigenous community as well.
Yeah. And it touched me when you said we will never be anything else but Indigenous people.
Exactly.
So the earlier we started to take pride in who we are, the better for us. And going back to the importance of language to culture, and you talked about how some people your age might understand the language, but they don't speak the language. Are there specific things now that are being done to preserve the language?
Well, I don't know if I shared with you during coffee, but I started up because of my concern for the rapid loss of language use in the, say, the Cree community, the Nehio community. My own kids don't speak Cree. My bad, I didn't teach them the language. And I feel bad about that sometimes. And I thought, okay, as I'm getting older, I should do something about it. A couple of years ago, I was reading information about the United Nations declared this is the decade of indigenous languages. So I thought to myself, I should do something. And so I submitted a proposal to Heritage Canada. Lo and behold, I got a small grant to initiate a project. So we called it the YXC Cree Speaker Society. And you can get information through my website at yxccreespeakersociety.ca. And so the idea was this, to gather as many fluent Cree speakers that I could find within Saskatchewan and Alberta, sit down with them for a day, couple days, and pick their brains, have a real good discussion. We had a strategy there. We had certain questions for them. And we took that data and that information to formulate our first conference, which we held last year at the Dakota Dunes Resort. And the feedback we got from our delegates, roughly 200 delegates, was amazing. So we just had our second conference this past spring, and we had a policy, and that is Cree language first, English second. So we had over 2 days, we heard...
Speaking majorly Cree.
Cree.
That is amazing.
All our panelists, our speakers, Cree first. And then we had a translator with earpiece. And so if they couldn't understand the language, or they're a beginner or didn't know any Cree, they had a translation on site. So we're going to continue this, and we got a lot of ideas, and we heard about from various language experts and educators on different methods of teaching the language. And there are many. There's at least 5 or 6 methods, and they're all good. But we also know that in our education system, for example, there's a new school being built. I think it's called St. Francis. I just heard about it. I know the building's coming up, and it's almost complete. But it's a Cree immersion program. But we found out from our language experts who have decades of experience in this space. I'm kind of new to it, but they told us in their research that they found that we're not spending enough hours teaching children, Indigenous children, their own languages. So, and it could take up to 50 years to teach a kid his own Indigenous language at the rate we're going. That's according to one study from a PhD friend of mine. And I thought, we don't have 50 years. We gotta speed this up. So we've exposed at our conference various methodologies, a variety of approaches and methods to teach the language and to preserve the language and then to teach it. So very exciting, because I myself am working on a digital product that can eventually children like my grandson. Inspired me really because of the hours he spends on his smartphone playing video games, all kinds of games. I thought if he spent a third of his time learning and playing a game in our language, he would be picking it up a lot faster.
Yes.
Right. So we're going to use technology to get to the younger ones and even adults, right? So again, it's a very exciting project I'm working on.
Yeah, that is also amazing. So as an outsider, not an Indigenous person, if I want to be part of this journey to reconciliation, what can I do individually?
I think some practical things people can do is do their own homework. There's a lot of this information, like you said earlier, is online now.
Yeah.
You can Google search all this information. It's amazing what's online today. What took me 4 years of learning in university, someone can learn in a matter of months now because of the information age and what's available digitally. attend some workshops, right? Get more familiar with and drill down a bit on certain topics that are of interest to you. Attend a powwow at the end of the month during Truth and Reconciliation Day, Orange Shirt Day. There will be another cultural celebration. Check those out. Don't be afraid. Those events, cultural gatherings, are not just for Indigenous peoples. But do a little homework and a little reading up on the cultural protocols, right? Taking photographs with the dancers and with the singers, and just follow the directions given by the powwow announcer, for example. Right? There's certain do's and don'ts. But those events are open to the general public. We encourage the general public to attend like powwow celebrations, as an example. Most people are a little nervous going initially, but once they're there and they've gone through the experience, it's like, it's all cool, right? So again, a little bit of reading, just hanging out, making friends, being genuinely interested. Make a friend, right? Go for coffee. Start with a coffee. And just take your time, because at the end of the day, many of our Indigenous peoples are very open, very welcoming. They've always been welcoming immigrants. For 150 years we've been doing that for a long time. We say tawa, welcome to our land, our traditional territories, and just get to know us. We don't bite, and that's all. Yeah, there's a lot of books now. You go to McNally's, Robinson's, the bookstore. Tons of books there you can read if you're a reader. There's audio podcasts on CBC, for example. You can learn more about issues, important, pertinent issues like residential schools and so on. So there's tons of resources like I've never seen before in my life. And I think with good work being done, the research done by many scholars, non-academics, podcasters, TikTokers, there's so much information now.
There's so much, This has been such a great learning experience. Thank you so much, Milton, for joining me on Across Cultures today. I have learned a lot, and also moving forward to take steps to contribute my part, definitely attending some of those cultural events, Indigenous cultural events this month, especially the powwow. I attended it once and I totally enjoyed it. So I'm going to take steps to do that as well. And my hope is that listeners also take steps on this journey to learn more about the Indigenous people, learn more about the culture. Like you said, there are tons of resources out there to take advantage of some of those resources as well. So thank you everyone for tuning in on today's episode of Across Cultures. You can listen again to all episodes of Across Cultures on my YouTube channel and on the podcast Across Cultures with Owen Steve. If there's a cultural topic you would like me to explore on this show, or a guest you think would be a great fit, please send me an email to owensteve@outlook.com. Until I come your way again with another insightful episode, I hope you keep an open mind to learn about and respect other people's cultures as we all work together to foster acceptance and belonging in our society. I am Owen Steve, and this is Across Cultures.